Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Title IX Consulting Group's podcast and YouTube videos, where we are bringing to you some good information and education with all things related to sexual violence and Title IX taking place around the country with public opinion. So today we're going to be talking about a new topic, and I'll go ahead and let Nandini ask some specific questions.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Sandy. I'm just going to get right into it. Basically, from what I've been reading online, it looks like France is ahead of the curve where sex education is concerned. So, the Education Minister, Elizabeth Bourne, is set to roll out a groundbreaking plan that will transform the way they're teaching sex ed in France. So, they're adopting a lens of equality and love. And the French Education Department is aiming to use sex ed as a tool to address sexual and gender-based violence. They are planning to incorporate age-appropriate material on gender identity and biological sex, where their approach is to educate without overwhelming students with too much information at once. This is starkly different from the way we've seen things play out in the US, where discussions of consent often come late, sometimes only after other aspects of sex education has already been covered, and oftentimes it even gets left out of household conversations. And that is something that France plans to rectify immediately by introducing the concept early on. So I think starting around the age of 4, the children will be engaging in role-playing scenarios and exercises such as asking questions like, can I hold your hand or can I sit next to you? And learning the importance of saying no when they don't want to engage in physical contact. And the way they have rolled it out, the way they're planning it is that as students mature, the curriculum will gradually introduce more nuanced topics, including distinctions between biological sex, gender, sexual orientation, sexuality, love, reproduction, facets of pleasure. And by the age of 16 is when they plan to teach students about the biological differences between men and women, while also emphasizing that these differences do not dictate self expression, behavior, or societal rules. And I think that's a very different and interesting take for sex ed from what I've seen in the US, the way I think I would compare it to even India. But back to you, Dr. Sandy. Do you think that implementing such an approach would be beneficial to US education curricula, or would it be appropriate enough to spark the necessary conversation at schooling levels about consent?
Yeah, thank you. That is such a great question and something that I've always worked with myself. Years ago, I spent 6 years educating school districts on sexual abuse prevention on the very topics you're describing. I was educating first graders in particular on how to say no, their bodies, consent, how to avoid abduction, how to avoid sexual abuse. And with all of that, I'm actually finalizing a children's book right now that I've always had in my back pocket. And I'm actually working with an illustrator in order to have a children's book to help individuals that are parents, teachers, therapists here in the United States understand how to have these conversations in a safe way because we're not having the conversations here. And it's really unfortunate because, as you said, here in the United States, there are several states right now that are implementing different programming for children addressing gender identity. However, they're not talking about the important topics of consent, of how to say no, that you have the right to say no to anyone, especially an authority figure, when things are not safe, they're dangerous, or you're scared. And so there is a big concern. So, yes, to answer your question, I think we should be following suit with France. When I saw that specific report, I immediately thought about my own research and the children's book that I'm about to release because of the fact that the United States is behind with this. And instead, we're implementing education that is very controversial at a very young age. I find it interesting that France is starting at the age of 16 to really discuss gender identity versus here. I mean, I'm hearing it as young as 7 years old. First grade classrooms are talking about sexual orientation and gender identity, yet they're not discussing consent. So to me, that's a problem here in the United States.
I agree with you. I think when I was reading about this, they're going to start introducing like topics about sexual orientation and like sexual identities. I think somewhere around the beginning of their teens, so that's like 13, 14 onwards, but they're laying the foundation by talking about consent. And I think even here in the US, like a few examples close to home that I've spoken to people, I've seen that like for like really young kids in elementary school, even in all over the US, actually, not specific to any place, they're talking about like all this overwhelming information, which is fine to hand out and whatever, but they're not talking about consent. They're not talking about safe feelings. They're not talking about like secure feelings. And that is something I've seen as a gap in India also, where in sex education it's taken like a purely reproductive lens and they don't teach you about consent. And like even in most cultures, in like family cultures at home, they don't talk about consent at home either. So you're kind of just learning this on the go when you're in like a relationship or when you're talking to your friends. And I don't think that's like the first introduction you should have to the concept of consent, learning it from your peers who may have the same level of knowledge about it as you.
Absolutely. And having worked with many victims, for example, there are many situations and cases where victims have learned that they could have said no after they were raped, after they were sexually assaulted. They didn't know that they could have said no initially because they were never taught about consent. And when I describe that, it's not that they're missing common sense. It's the fact that many individuals might be at a Christian university. They may have grown up, very religious, where they've been told to wait till they're married. And then they're in a relationship with a boyfriend who is pressuring them nonstop, for example. And all of a sudden, they're alone in a car, they're alone in a room, and the individual is pressuring them to a point where there's force. And out of shame, out of not knowing what to do, females sometimes are, they freeze and things happen and they're assaulted and or they're raped. And so consent and safety teaches individuals how to avoid circumstances like that. Not to say that it's the victim's fault in any which way, but in order to understand how to prevent situations, how to not allow an individual to overpower you because of the fact that you didn't know that you had the right to say no, that you had the right to different options. Um, and so I believe you're right, Nandini. I think that consent needs to be taught, safety needs to be taught, and those things need to be taught first before even discussing gender identity, before talking about reproductive options and sexuality and how to have sex. We need to talk about consent first. We need to talk about safety and respect, mutual respect, what lines and boundaries can exist, and what boundaries you can place in a relationship that you have the right to do so. I think those are the first things we need to be discussing. And so France is doing it right. I applaud France because they are truly making us think about doing it in the right way. If they can do it, I think we can do it too in the United States. And similar to how you just described, Nandini, in India, they skipped consent, they skipped the safety aspects, they skipped the boundaries. In the United States, we're doing the same. We skipped consent. We skipped, all the safety aspects and we jumped straight to gender identities. So there's a gap, there's a problem. And I think this is a great topic, that we should be discussing. Is there anything further that you think we should talk about regarding this?
No, I think it's just like my concluding thought would probably be that it's really nice to see that at like age 4, they're starting the practice of talking about consent, even from like basic like day-to-day instances of like, can I hug you? Can I hold your hand? teaching the importance of setting boundaries that are comfortable to the self in a way, and carrying that idea forth helps, I think, an individual understand consent better as well. Because if suddenly at like in your teens or like in your 20s, you're introduced to this idea of that, oh, consent is actually a thing, you're very overwhelmed. You're like, where do my boundaries lie? How do I define these boundaries? So starting it as a young practice is, I think, like a really, really great idea. And I think a lot of countries can benefit from following like the same suit on these matters.
Yeah, I agree. Starting young is important. I can say that when I was doing my own research and working for the mental health organization, actually doing the work with young children, with young minds against sexual abuse, at that time, I thought to myself from the research I was doing, 5 years old was the appropriate age to start the conversations. I love that France is starting at the age of 4, but I can tell you, I'm currently writing the children's book and I'm also wrapping up a Title IX textbook as well. And within this book, the age that I'm actually saying now is 3 years old. So I love the fact that it's all within 3, 4, 5 years old. The reason I now say 3 years old is because of my own daughter. My daughter's 3.5, and I have been talking to her age appropriately about her own body, about it's okay to say no, about boundaries, give a high five if you don't want to hug somebody, give a fist bump if you don't want to hug somebody or give the high five. If you hug someone, it's because you're comfortable. So things like that. So teaching very basic things early on and then growing and scaffolding that, into something more complex throughout the ages, throughout the years is important, especially to preserve safety, preserve boundaries, and really help instill what the rights are of individuals.
I agree. And I also think, and I may be jumping the gun when I make this assumption, but I also think teaching them early on about respecting boundaries, just as a basic idea, would also help them grow into more respectful individuals with topics about gender identities and sexual orientations, because they'll understand their boundaries and they'll be respectful of other people's boundaries as well. So even if they don't understand the concepts of everything, they'll at least have innate respect for the other person just by respecting their boundaries and what's comfortable for them. So I think this is the more I think about it, I really love the idea that they start the conversation so early on. I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think that's great. Well, thank you so much, Nandini, and thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you.